Hello, I'm Professor Emily Jeremiah and I'm going to be delivering a brief taster session on poetry translation, and the session arises from a module I teach on called ML1400 Introduction to Translation Professional Skills. Now, it's sometimes said that poetry is what gets lost in translation, so you can't actually translate a poem. Translation is often thought of in terms of prose, so the idea is that you haul the meaning from one linguistic context over the language barrier into another context, and the meaning of the text is preserved. It's as if it's given new clothes in accordance with the rules of readability in the target language. But if you think of translation in terms of poetry, then it becomes very complex and very interesting. As the late translator Tarja Roinila said, if poetry is taken as a model for translation, things become more complicated. At first, it seems that one cannot say anything about poetry translation. Thinking about translation presupposes that form and meaning can be separated. A poem, however, resists this division. The content of a poem is nothing without rhythm, harmonies, the arrangement composed in the source language. The tie between meaning and letter is unbreakable. And she carries on with these reflections before coming to the conclusion at the end of her piece that works of poetry want to be translated because they are not finished products or self-sufficient. Translation is not an additional activity to be carried out on the original work, but rather an organic part of its life. It is as important as writing poetry, its natural continuation. Translation, like reading, is poetry's way of breathing. It is self-evident, simple and unavoidable for poetry's own reasons. A poem calls for translation. So the idea that poetry translation is inevitable is, I think, a fascinating and liberating one. And I think an interesting exercise that one can undertake when it comes to thinking about translation is to compare two different versions of the same text and to see how they differ, and to see how vital and how viral language is, poetic language in particular. So here's an example. This is a poem called The Town, or Kaupunki in the original, that I translated from by the Finnish modernist Eva-Liisa Manner. The Town. How the houses have grown in this town. The gulf's deepened, the water blackened. Soon it'll creep onto the streets. The railings are rickety, the groundwater's rising, the cellars are full. Fear is rising. Fear is hidden behind oppressive discretion and flagrant offences. Soon we'll need boats. Do you hear the roar? Take to the boats. Hats are no use now. Or if you plunge in bravely, carry the word beyond the distress lights. Okay, so this translation forms part of a selection of poems by Eva-Liisa Manner that I published in 2009 with Waterloo Press, Bright, Dusky, Bright. So now let's look at an earlier version of that poem, which is called The City, and it's by Herbert Lomas. How the houses have spread in this city. Things have caved in, the water's blackened. Soon the streets will be all awash. The railings are rusted, the water table's rising, the cellars are slopping, fear's rising, screened by strangling discretion, flagrant crime. We'll be needing boats, listen to the swell, take to the boats, forget your hats, or if you plunge bravely in, carry the word to the other side of the distress lights. So you can see there are clear differences between these versions of the same poem. And so what's illustrated, I think, are the vitality and the virality of poetic language. So poetic language is really multivalent. An interesting theme that I think illustrates this question further is rhyme. So should a poem that rhymes be translated in rhyming form? And one exercise that I carry out with students is a comparison of translations that rhyme with translations that don't, and we see which are the most successful versions and which also are the most faithful, which is a kind of interesting term in translation studies and a very sort of tricky term. So here's an example of a poem that I translated that I felt simply had to rhyme in translation, and you'll see why. It's by a poet called Helvi Juvonen. A strange tapir. In Borneo, in the forest dense and lush, there sleeps a stone of reddish hue, content, a blush, concealed, a hush. A strange tapir, the bi-coloured one, a wondrous tapir, the many-toed one. Circles the tree, goes round and about. A small word hangs from the tip of his snout, and you can see the rest of the poem there on the slide. So it seemed to me there that rhyme was essential because this is a kind of nonsense poem, and the meaning of the text depends on the sound of the words. So I hope I've illustrated by means of this short session how exciting, how fascinating questions relating to poetry translation are.